Are you someone who likes to follow the rules or someone that likes to break them? And if you like to follow them, how do you get around being how do you get around rule-bound religion? So my name is Kirkby-Sing and I'm minister at LBK Presbyterian Church, and today our gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And so he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the disciples went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. So again, perhaps do you consider yourself a rule-bound person? Well, even if you're not, the obviously laws and rules apply to us, don't they? And we noticed this during the lockdown as the guidelines changed. Sometimes we'd feel we were under, a bit of confusion about what we could or couldn't do. There were different reactions. There were those who thought they were above the law, like certain ministers, politicians, and then there were those who aggressively made sure that other people stuck to the guidelines, such as the person who, when they learned that their 70-year-old neighbour was going to the shops, they went over and told her that if she went out again, that they would slash her tyres. It's pretty excessive, isn't it? But this really reflects, I guess, different approaches to rules, to laws. Firstly, there's the rule-keeping approach. There are rules, and it's we've got to learn them in order to do well in life. And that's a bit like me. I want rules to help me to follow, and they can give clarity and reassurance. The other approach is that rules are really the restrictive, and life is all about freedom, and so you've got to rules are made to be broken. How dare people kind of create these rules to kind of cramp our style? And if you've got a child of a certain age, you might know about someone who prefers that approach to rules. We can approach the Christian faith in this way too. We can see the Christian faith is all about rules and about applying, rules to our lives, rules from the Bible. Or we can say, and this is quite popular, approaches that, it's all about freedom and liberty. Jesus came to set us free from rules so that we can, just live a life of freedom and self-expression. Of course, these common ways, I would say, are common misunderstandings. The Bible does contain rules, but it's not primarily a rule book. And the Bible does show us how to be free, but it's not a book about our personal self-expression. It's about God. And our God shows us how we can live as truly free people under his rule, right? So, and we see Jesus saying this in chapter 11 of actually the reading from last week. Jesus says, "Come to me," verse 28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And so we see here Jesus talking about his yoke, his way, like living life in him, under his rule. And for Jesus and for us, this should give us rest. chapter 12 is set on a day of rest. And so we see what Jesus' approach to that day, and we can contrast it with this other group in that society and how they operated. So let's have a look, shall we? Have a look at verse 1. It says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them." Okay, so we see what's going on there. And we see what happens then in verse 2. "When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.'" What is unlawful on the Sabbath? What is the Sabbath? That's really the first question. The Sabbath is a significant day. It was part of the instructions given through Moses that Israel should observe the Sabbath as a day of rest. We see it comes from Exodus chapter 20, from verse 8, where it says, "Remember," and so this is the fourth of the 10 Commandments. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." We see in that description in Exodus that the Sabbath was both a day to remember God, to remember the work that he had done in creation, but also a day for them to rest. Not just for them, for their servants, for the animals, for all creation. All creation remembered God and rested. And this tells us a couple of things, obviously. The Sabbath is the Lord's day. It's a day that he's given. It's a gift. And the second, it's a day of rest. It's a day in which they can rest as well. It's not, therefore, to be seen as some kind of oppressive restriction or rule, but a gift for people. The problem really isn't about the Sabbath day. It's about the approach to it. So religion is not the problem, it's the approach. And we see the Pharisees' approach in their kind of accusation. "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Now the Pharisees, they were the group in that century who were really concerned for the application of the law, how it was actually lived out in everyday life. And so the fourth commandment said, "On it you shall do no work on the seventh day." And so the Pharisees asked, well, what does do no work actually mean? I mean, what does it mean to do no work? There are a few, obviously, examples and guidelines in the scriptures, but it didn't cover every possibility. And so the Pharisees were the guys who wanted to apply such a law to everyday life. And so they write, those life application notes in their Bibles to explain, how to apply these rules in every kind of situation they could think of. The problem comes with that focus really on behaviour, on kind of applying those rules, on what people could or could not do on the Sabbath, and this kind of created a burden. Now the intention may have been good to keep the day as a day of rest and worship, but the application of it became a burden for the people. Now, of course, it's not just them. This is what we do as humans. We look at something and we say, well, how do we actually apply that? And we add a whole lot of details, and sometimes the details can make us miss the point of the rule or the law. So, for example, Sunday for many of us, in a time gone by, it generally was a day off. It was a day of worship and rest. Negatively, this was seen as a day of no fun and no enjoyment, no play. You couldn't do certain things on a Sunday. And the issue was that, that people lost sight of the reason for keeping Sunday as a special day. Well, this is what we tend to do as humans. We tend to kind of create these rules and standards upon which we can kind of look down upon others. This is the tendency of rule-bound religion. We see this, and we do this. We judge others in the way they do things. For example, in church, in the Christian church, You may think that unless you're a church that meets in a real church building, and unless the church has a real minister that wears a clerical collar, and unless you sing proper hymns with good theology, and unless they have, you keep your hands at your side, and unless you have a proper liturgy, then it's not a real church. It's not a real church service. On the other hand, some people think, unless you meet in like a modern, comfortable building, and unless you sing really modern, contemporary songs, unless you raise your hands and close your eyes in worship, then unless you do these things, then you're not obviously a genuine Christian. You obviously don't have a genuine relationship with the Lord. Well, I hope you can see the problem here in these kind of stereotypes. The problem is the focus on the externals. It's not that these kind of questions are unimportant, because I think they are, but it's when we use them as a way to measure, or as a way to judge, or as a way to criticize or nitpick. And when we do this, we miss the point. And the point of worship, it's not about what we do, it's about God. It's a response to what God has done. This is kind of, I guess, expressed in terms of worship in that worship song by Matt Redman from some years ago, The Heart of Worship. I'm coming back to the heart of worship. It's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. And sometimes we lose sight of the purpose of why we do these things. And the Pharisees, the problem for them is that they lost sight of what they were meant to be doing. And the question for us is, how do we keep from doing that? How do we keep from becoming rule-bound in our approach to religion? Well, let's look at Jesus and what he says. Verses 3 to 7. He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? And I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." The first thing I want to say is that Jesus' response isn't like that first kind of response to rules. He's not like an ancient John Lennon. You guys, just kind of take it easy, man. You got to live free, and all you need is like peace and love. No, Jesus isn't like that. He gave us the law. So in response, he turns to the scriptures, and he provides two examples that kind of illustrate actually the intent of the law. The first one is from 1 Samuel 21. This is verses 3 and 4 right now in our reading today. And this is where Jesus reminds them of David, who, when David and his companions were hungry, they went to and there was obviously no shops open. They went to the temple, and David went into the temple, and he got the bread that was consecrated. This bread was not ordinary bread. It wasn't used for ordinary purposes. It would be consumed by the priests. And we see how David is able to kind of overrule this. And that partly is because he has the authority to do that. He is the anointed one. After all, he's going to be the new king of Israel. But also we see there's an exception being made on compassionate grounds, because David and his men were hungry. I mean, David wouldn't have done this if they had food, right? It's only because there's a compassionate with a situation which requires compassion. And so David had the authority to do something that perhaps would be considered unlawful on compassionate grounds. Jesus gives another example or illustration. This is taken from Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 and 10. We see it in verse 5. "Haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent?" Well, Jesus is speaking in hyperbole, of course. The priests, they do work on the Sabbath. They're working. They're at work. So, how can that be? Because they're breaking the law. God says in Exodus 28 or 20, the fourth commandment, that, you're not to do work, but yet the priests do work on the Sabbath. Well, that kind of highlights the problem with the way the Pharisees were approaching the rules And it proves the point that the main point of the Sabbath is not to not do work. The main point is to worship God and to rest, because that obviously is what the priests were doing on the Sabbath. And for us who enjoy having Sunday as a day off, that doesn't mean that no one can do any work. And obviously, ministers will be doing work on a Sunday. And back in the day when you had your family, when no one did any work, but you still had the big family dinners, and who cooked those family dinners on a Sunday, the family roast? That was work, wasn't it? And so this kind of rule-bound approach to life kind of misses the point. And for the Pharisees, it stopped them really seeing who was right there in front of them. Jesus, of course. And Jesus tells them, verse 6, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Something greater than the temple is here. Jesus isn't undermining the law. He's not undermining the Sabbath. He's not undermining the temple. But he's showing them, or telling them, that he is the one that these things point to. Jesus is greater than the law. He's greater than the Sabbath day. He's greater than the temple. And he shows them his approach in his next verse too. Verse 7, he gives them one of his favourite memory verses. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So that's from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. So he's saying if they were following this principle, they would not have been so quick to judge. And finally he comes back to his own authority in verse 8. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so Jesus shows us that the purpose of God's law is not to tie people up in red tape, but to set them free to love God and to love their neighbour. And so he's not merely a servant of the law. Like David, he has that kind of authority. He is the master. He is the one to which the law points. And so that's really round one. In that first kind of scene in Matthew chapter 12, and there we have Jesus 1, Pharisees 0. Now we're on to round 2. And here the stakes are raised. You'll see it goes from verse 9. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. And a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And Matthew writes, looking for a reason to charge him. Well, obviously, it's a bit of a trap for Jesus, isn't it? They may have placed him, he's a plant. They found this man who's got this issue, and they're like, how can we trap Jesus? They want to make Jesus do some work in order to test him, in order to show how, he breaks the Sabbath command, and so he really can't be trusted, or he shouldn't be followed. And so the issue here is not about, can Jesus heal this man? We know that Jesus can heal. If you've read Matthew 1 through to Matthew 12, you know that Jesus is a healer. This is not the question for the Pharisees. They know this. The issue is, does he keep God's law? Does he keep the Sabbath? He responds not with a scripture, but with an example of one of their applications. In verse 11, he says to them, if any of you has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? So I'm sure that if you're a farmer, you understand the value of sheep. Sheep are valuable property. And losing one means a loss of income, a loss of food, nourishment. Also in this case, if a sheep falls into a pit, obviously it's in trouble, it's going to get be in pain, it's going to suffer. So there's the issue of compassion as well. So surely, if a sheep fell into a pit on the Sabbath, you would, for all those reasons, you would go and rescue it. This was obviously something that they had, an exception that they already agreed, they'd already written it up in their life application Bibles. And so they get it. And Jesus makes his point, verse 12. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus here isn't anti-law, is he? He's showing the purpose of the law, the principle. Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. If it's okay to rescue a sheep, how much more is it okay to heal someone on the Sabbath? And so I think we all understand what Jesus is saying here. He's showing the Pharisees the the inadequacy of that kind of rule-bound approach. A rule-bound religion tends to leave us in red tape. It can tell us what we should do, and when we don't do it, it condemns us, but it can't save us. It can't rescue us. We see what Jesus does, verse 13. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. As opposed to rule-bound religion, we see here good news. Jesus brings good news. Jesus is God in the flesh. He shows compassion, the compassionate love of God. The problem for Pharisees wasn't the law, it was their approach to it. And their approaches to things obviously come from mindsets, and they come from heart sets. They come from hearts and minds. And so the problem really, underlying it, for them and for us, is our hearts, the condition of our hearts. And we see what Jesus does. He shows them God's love. But what this does is highlights the sin and the evil and the wickedness in their hearts. I mean, just look at verse 14. Jesus has just healed someone on the Sabbath, right? Verse 14, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. They couldn't see it. They couldn't see Jesus. They couldn't see the good news. They couldn't see what he had done. All they could see was someone who had kind of embarrassed them, shown them up, and who in their eyes had broken the law by working. And this hatred in their hearts would eventually drive them to killing Jesus. And this is what happens to us. This is what we do. So how do you get around this? How do we escape from this? How do we escape from rule-bound religion? Well, this is what his point is. This is what Matthew is driving at from Matthew chapter 1 verse to chapter 28. That Jesus is the solution. Jesus is the way. That coming to him, seeing him as the center, he fulfills the law. He fulfills this fulfillment of the Sabbath. He's at the center. He's the reason for all that we do. And once you know the reason, you know why you should do something. Once you know the reason for going to church, you'll see it. You'll know why you should do it. Once you see the reason, you'll know that worship isn't a duty, but it's a delight. And so, for example, rather than telling your kids, you've got to go to church because it's what Christians do, it's the rule for Christians. No, it's not. It is what Christians do, but we go to church because it's because of Jesus, because of him, because of what he has done for us. So worship at its heart is not about obeying rules and trying to kind of measure up. Rather, it's a response to the compassionate love of our merciful and gracious and holy God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's about the God who sent his Son, the God who is greater than the temple. It's about the Good Shepherd who sees that just like sheep, we too fall into pits and that we break the law and that we're mired in sin and death. But like a good shepherd, he doesn't leave us in there, but he gets in and then he pushes us out. And in that pit or on that hill or on that cross, he takes our sin upon himself and dies. Well, once you know that Jesus has done this for you, you'll see he is the merciful Lord of the Sabbath. And you'll know why we should rest and worship. And I think this changes everything. So I'm going to close with one example from a Scottish preacher called Sinclair Ferguson, and he kind of writes about this. And he says, this is his story. I was brought up by devoted parents who, although they did not attend church until after I became a Christian in my late teens, made sure I kept the Sabbath day. Now this would be Scotland, probably in the 1950s. And he writes, no work was done in the house. The idea that I would be allowed to go out to play was as remote as my flying to school. And so the Sabbath day, and he means a Sunday, the Sabbath day was a day of prolonged misery, a real burden, a day of not doing, a day to which not a day to which I look forward. I can still sense the transformation that took place in my experience of Sunday when I became a Christian, he writes. It was now no more of a burden than a bird's wings. Rather than crush me, it seemed to sustain me. And boredom was gone. It became the best day of the week. And yet it was still Sunday. It was still the first day of the week. But the sense of duty in going to the church services which I had attended and the Bible reading which I'd been doing for several years, believing that doing these things might make me a Christian, well, these seemed overnight to be transformed into delight. What was the explanation? He writes. Simple. We need to come to Christ to find true Sabbath rest. For then God writes his law into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. And then at last we receive the law from the hands of the one who came to bring us forgiveness and power, and no longer from the hands of the Pharisees. And then we can call the Sabbath our delight. And that's an end quote. But I think sums up what we're saying this morning. Jesus can set us free. He does set us free from rule-bound religion. And Jesus says to you and me, come to me, and I'll give you rest.